Okay. Well, thanks for being here tonight, everybody. And we're going to get rolling because we have week 3 is probably the most content packed week on my syllabus because we're going to be talking about the standards, objectives, and actually creating a lesson plan. I know some of you have already started submitting your lesson plan for the assignment. If you've already started doing it using the one that Brandman provided, that's fine. I won't dock you. But my job isn't necessarily to make sure you know, get a great grade. You're all going to pass this class as long as you keep up on your work, but I want to prepare you as much as I can for the classroom. So I've posted a lesson plan that I feel is much more robust than the one that Brandman provides. It's called a direct interactive instruction lesson plan, and I've created a long form which has an explanation of every section. Hopefully you found it in the activities folder for week 3. I'd like you to use that for your assignment if possible, and just to become familiar with it. Tonight we're going to go through it, talk about each section, talk about what the teacher's responsibility is in each section of a lesson, and what the student's responsibility is, how to create one, where to start. So hopefully you find tonight's class informative, and we're going to get rolling. So hopefully we don't run into so many technical issues like we did last week. Now that I'm sharing my screen. So our TPEs tonight, we're talking about state adopted content standards, long-term, short-term goals for student learning, which is planning, planning and explaining content clearly, understanding purposes, strengths, and limitations of a variety of instructional strategies, sequencing, which is very important when we talk about a lesson plan, and then connecting content with background. We've been talking a little bit about background for the last couple of weeks through differentiation and brain development and things like that, and now we're going to start tying it together and how do we create lessons to meet the needs of students. And we're going to always talk about differentiation. So tonight you'll be able to create a teachable objective by deconstructing a California Common Core standard. This is a fun activity I lead all of my teachers through every single fall. We practice this all the time because it's always about teachable objectives. And students will be able to identify the components of a direct instruction lesson plan as well. Hopefully I'll give you some time to collaborate with peers in some breakout rooms since you liked those last week. But we got to get rolling. And then we're going to start touching upon Webb's depth of knowledge, or DOK, as many of you have heard it. So what you want to focus on in teaching is CIA, curriculum, instruction, and assessment. All of that should revolve around students, and all of them are just as important. What you teach is the curriculum, how you teach it is the instruction, and whether or not they learned it is your assessment. And all of those things feed off of each other. Your assessments are going to tell you what to teach and how to teach. Your curriculum's going to usually tell you what to assess. I don't like curriculum embedded assessments as much as I like standards embedded assessments, because that's what we always want to teach is the standards, and we want to find curriculum that aligns the standards, not we don't want to be curriculum driven because that could pigeonhole us, like we talked about a little bit last week. Who you teach is always very important. Make sure you know your students. Curriculum instruction assessment needs to be responsive to the needs of your students. So every year you're going to have different classes, different kids. So you shouldn't be teaching the same thing when it comes to your curriculum and your instruction. When it comes to standards, yes, of course, those are the minimum requirements for every year. But you want to make sure you're adapting those standards to your students' needs through curriculum and instruction and assessment. Information to gather, and sorry we're flying through these first slides because they're kind of review, but to gather you want to get their linguistic, academic, content, knowledge, skills, physical, social, emotional development, interests, special needs, learning styles, all those things you need to know and consider when you're building your lessons. What you teach is the content of your instruction. We have the Common Core standards, the California State Common Core standards now because we have our own because we're California. And that's how we roll in California. We do everything differently. We have the NGSS, the Next Generation Science Standards. And then we have the 21st Century Interdisciplinary Themes and Skills. We also have the ELD framework. We have the Social Studies framework that's coming out, and a lot more that's going to start kind of guiding teachers what we need to teach. Content areas, English, language arts, and math, of course, are the big ones that have Common Core. And PE, notice that the 3 asterisks, those 3 top ones, are the only 3 content areas in the state of California that are mandated that you teach. You have to teach a minimum amount of minutes in each of those 3 areas. In physical education, it's 200 minutes every 2 weeks. Even more important than science, history, health, VAPA, and career CTE. is physical education according to our legislature. So make sure you're hitting those 200 minutes every 2 weeks. There was a lawsuit about 7 years ago where some guy decided to sue every school in California and ask for their minutes to make sure that they were doing that. So schools started logging their PE minutes because he knew that not everybody was teaching 200 minutes of PE every 2 weeks, which is true. You only have a certain amount of minutes in a day, and PE typically, unfortunately, falls off, and people use recess as PE, but recess does not count. Common Core standards were adopted in 2010 by 45 states. That's changed dramatically since 2010. A lot of states have gone to their own standards where the Common Core have influenced them. There was a lot of controversy. None of the controversy was really over the standards, the what was being taught. It was the how it's being taught was where all the controversy was. If you were turning into Fox News, you saw that parents were trying to pull their kids out of schools that were teaching Common Core. And really, anytime I had a parent, because I had parents come to me and ask and were concerned, I shared all the standards with them. I said, go ahead and highlight anything you don't want us to teach your child, and I'll make sure we do that. And they would come back, and there was no highlights in the book of standards because they wanted their kids to know everything. And so they had asked me, what's the big controversy? I said, well, it's under Appendix B, which is some recommended readings that the state of California said would help students access those content standards. And so there was some titles in the appendix that had conservative families up in arms. So when we finally kind of blew all the smoke away from that, and we discovered that, wow, these standards are actually pretty great. And so we're sticking with them for now. English language arts strands. We're going to look at both ELA and math here. So you have the reading, writing, listening, and speaking and language. Those are the 4 strands, and they're also called your anchor standards. And then there's more cross-disciplinary teaching in English language arts than there ever has been. And if you're teaching PE, science, technical subjects, history, social studies, you're finding out that there's a lot of writing involved because you're seeing that writing, listening, speaking, language, and reading all align themselves to those areas. So we can actually maximize the amount of exposure our students get in those other disciplinary areas. Anchor standards, which these are the standards that cut across all kindergarten through 12 grade levels, right? So those are those broad standards. They're organized by strands: reading, writing, listening, and speaking, and language. And within each strand, there are domains that are consistent across grade levels, and this is what it looks like. So you have college and career readiness that is the overarching umbrella with reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language. And then you can see the foundational skills in reading are K5. And then there's that appendices, right? B, text exemplars illustrating complexity. That was the big controversy. But that's a great little visual there. And so this shows that there's, now with the Common Core standards, there's much more consistency across grade levels. Math, we have the same thing, right? We have what's called the standards for math practice, and there are 8 standards that go across all 8 grade levels. And I want you guys to take a look at this next visual I'm going to share. Really powerful, and it's something that if you're teaching any math, you really should get to know. And we're going to actually have our attendance question tonight stem from this visual here. These are the standards for student mathematical practice. We look at number 1. Making sense of problems and persevering in solving them, reasoning abstractly and quantitatively, constructing viable arguments and critiquing the reasons of others, modeling our math with visuals, show your thinking, using appropriate tools strategically, attending to precision, looking for and making use of structure, and looking for and expressing regular and repeated reasoning. These go across every grade level. So my attendance question tonight: which of these 8 mathematical practice standards do you feel is the most important? 1 to 2 sentences, and then make sure you email that to me, and then I'll know you were listening tonight. All right, so take a look at those. Make sure you remember those, or you don't have to memorize them, but that's a great poster to have in your classroom when you get started, because that's really what it's all about. It's if you can get your students to be proficient in those 8 areas, you're doing a great job. Traditional pathway and the integrated pathway we've talked about. I'm sure some of you have already gone through high school and the integrated path, Math 1, Math 2, Math 3, advanced courses and calculus and statistics. We're starting to offer some of these more advanced courses in the junior high levels now too. Then on top of the standards in language arts and math, and then of course the next generation science standards, we have these background themes going on, right? We have the 4Cs, we have interdisciplinary themes of global awareness, civic literacy. These are all things that have to be taught almost like it's a train track that's running parallel to language arts. So is global awareness and civic literacy and environmental literacy and life and career skills and media and technology skills and creativity and innovation and critical thinking and communicate. All these things are running parallel to the what you're teaching, right? So not only are we just, and we'll see a more traditional method of developing a lesson back in the old days, back when I was in school, compared to now, which is you're really taking into consideration all of these different interdisciplinary skills and these worldviews into your classroom as you create lessons. Students are interacting with content much more than they ever did before because we used to sit and get, right? The teacher used to be the keeper of all knowledge. Now I've got everything the world has ever known in my pocket, literally, as a student. And so the teacher becomes the facilitator of how I should use that and apply it. And so that's where we look at creativity, innovation, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, the 4Cs. Am I going too fast?
No, you're good. Thank you.
All right.
No.
All right. Information, media, technology skills. This is huge, right? This is so big right now. We got to teach our students to be literate in looking at information online and being able to discern what's real, what's not real, what's false, what's true. Because just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. Wikipedia, things like that, students are citing their evidence from there. That's where teachers have to spend even more of their time now, as opposed to, checking students' facts to make sure they match up with the actual facts. They're having to make sure they check their sources to make sure that they're reliable sources. Life and career skills, flexibility, adaptability, initiative, self-direction, cross-cultural productivity, accountability. How do you teach that in primary and everything else, right? Those are tough skills to teach, but we have to create environments where this is the learning environment of our classrooms. Sitting in rows where you stand up and teach is it's getting to be obsolete. We have to give our students a more student-centered approach. Now, I say that, with a grain of salt tonight, because tonight we are talking about teacher-centered instruction and direct instruction, but we're going to talk about it in a way that's meaningful, because sending your students off to do collaborative learning when they have no background knowledge in an area or a topic is kind of sending sheep to the wolves. So let's get right into it. So how you teach, a continuum of instructional approaches. So we go from the left side, which is direct, to the right side, which is independent. Direct instruction is teacher-centered. Independent learning is student-centered. Now, we can argue the pedagogy of what's more powerful, what locks in long term, probably for days. I'll for every bit of research you give me on one side supporting your point of view, I can provide research on the other. This is one of those things that we're going to talk about forever and a day, about what's more productive, what's more important in the classrooms. The thing is it's not an either or; it's a both and. They're very important, both approaches. So the types of planning we're going to talk about: lesson planning. Your individual lesson. You should be planning your lessons every day. I know that's overwhelming, but guess what? Teachers are college educated. You make good money in California, and you should be planning. You should be staying after work and planning your lessons for the next day. What happened back in the early 2000s with Reading First is curriculum started writing out their plans, right? So you have these textbooks that here's the plan already done. Well, what does that forget to take into consideration? What did we spend the first 2 weeks talking about? It doesn't consider your kids, right? So somebody from some other state or somewhere else wrote this lesson plan. They don't know who your kids are. You know who your kids are. So I just want to encourage you and empower you to take the good stuff that you get in your curriculum and make sure you're writing plans that are effective for your students and what you know about them. You should be planning weekly. What do you want to get? That could be a little more easy, right? What do you want to accomplish? What objectives do you want to hit during the week? Your unit, what do you hope your students learn in this unit of study? And for a whole course, a whole semester, a whole term, even a whole year. Tonight, we're going to focus mainly on lesson planning. So the traditional lesson planning process, circa 1984, back when I was in grade school, select a topic from the curriculum, right? Johnny Appleseed, design instructional activities. We're gonna eat apples, yellow, red, and green, and we're gonna create a graph on which ones we like better. Design and give an assessment, give greater feedback, and moving on to the next topic, pumpkins. So that was the way it was done in the old days. It didn't matter if, what we were interested in or whether or not I already knew how to graph or if I was allergic to apples or whatever. The teacher just kept on plowing through material. Now we have a more standards-based approach. So we select the content standard. And look at this. You actually design an assessment first. Because if you think to DeFore's research on professional learning communities, the first question that he wants us to ask is, what do we want our students to learn? That's the standard, okay? How will we know that they learned it? That's the assessment. And now I'm going to create instructional activities that are going to make sure that they're successful on that assessment, that I'm assessing the right thing. How many times when you were in school did you sit and learn and then you're given an assessment, you're like, oh my gosh, we didn't learn it this way. That's not fair. Then you want to assess, use the data to give you feedback so you can adjust your plans. Do I need to reteach this? How about if you give an assessment before you start teaching and find out that 70% of your kids already know the objective? That's good data. What should you do? Probably turn the page and then catch the other 30% of your kids up. But you have to figure out what students know and what they don't know. All right, so this is I just love doing this. We're going to deconstruct the Common Core standards. How many of you are familiar with the Common Core standards? How many of you played with them a little bit? Friday night, all your friends are out, and you've got the Common Core standards. I would encourage you to go onto your app store on your phone and download a Common Core standards app. And there's lots of them. They're free, and you can look at the grade level you want to teach, the content area. But it's nice to start looking at what these standards look like. They're massive, and so we're going to take a look at one of them tonight. So this is third grade operations and algebraic thinking, and it's standard A3. Here it is, third grade. Use multiplication and division within 100 to solve word problems in situations involving equal groups, arrays, and measurement quantities. For example, by using drawings and equations with a symbol for the unknown number to represent the problem. What do you think? Ready, set, go. Teach that. Well, how do you teach that? If your principal comes and says, I want you to teach this standard, well, there's a whole lot of stuff going on in this standard. And what's going on in these standards is there are teachable objectives. And I want to show you guys how to pull out the objective. Because when you create a lesson plan, your lesson plan should address one objective at a time. Unless you really want to murky up the waters and muddy up the waters and get students confused. One objective at a time. So let's take a look. How many objectives do you think are embedded in this standard? And what are they? Go ahead and start popping them on in the chat there. What's one objective in this standard? What's one thing, students, that you can teach students? Multiply and divide within 100. How about, break it down. Use multiplication within 100. Use multiplication, good. Use arrays. Good. See, now you're kind of getting it, right? Yeah, exactly, Jocelyn. Multiplication and division are two separate computations. They're totally different. So let's take a look. You're going to get blown away. Ready? Here we go. So here's that standard. Here we go. Here's objective number 1. This could be a lesson all day. You could teach this for 2 or 3 days. If it's third grade, you might even be teaching this for 3 months. Use multiplication within 100 to solve word problems, because there's actually 2 things going on in just that objective. Being able to multiply within 100, not to mention the word problem part, right? So there's objective number 1. Use multiplication with 100 to solve word problems in situations involving equal groups. Okay, that's different than just solving regular word problems. Use multiplication within 100 to solve word problems in situations involving arrays. Use multiplication within 100 to solve word problems in situations by using drawings. Same, use division within 100 to solve word problems. And so on and so forth. So we've seen that there's at least 8 objectives in that one standard. At least 8 objectives in one standard. So that standard, you're not going to teach that standard in one day. That standard is going to take you weeks, months to teach in 3rd grade especially. You have to be able to break it down. You have to be able to identify, what is it that I want my student to learn today? How am I going to know that they learned it, right? If you have the data that says they learned how to multiply within 100 to solve a word problem, can you move on? Absolutely. That's what's going to guide you on that time question, Gisela, right? How much time do you give to teach the standard? That's up to your kids, right? If you, I mean, we can get technical. We can kind of divvy out. We have 180 days of school, take away Christmas and all these activities and things. You have probably 165 days of school, minimum days. You have, you know, how many standards broken into 8 objectives. Yeah, you don't have, there's not enough time in each day to make sure you're teaching everything. Fortunately, we've been able to identify. You can go on to focus on the core. Write that down because it's not in my plan. But focusonthecore.com has identified, especially in math, the most important standards your students need to learn in each grade level. All right, so moving on. So let's look at 1st grade operations and algebraic thinking C6. Let's do this one together. Add and subtract within 20, demonstrating fluency for addition and subtraction within 10. Use strategies such as counting on, making 10, decomposing a number leading to 10, using relationships between addition and subtraction, and creating equivalent but easier or known sums. Hello, 1st grade. Any 1st grade teachers out there? That changes, Suzanne, in every grade level. There's a different number of standards, but you could check it out on that app. I can't answer that off the top of my head.
I want to be a 1st grade teacher.
Oh, there you go. Look at this standard. Check that thing out. So who's talking right now?
Gisela.
All right, Gisela.
Hello.
Tell me one objective in this standard.
To add and subtract within 20.
That's actually 2 objectives, right?
Oh, really? Oh, yeah.
Adding.
You're right. You're right.
For a
to
1st
add
grader.
within 20.
Yeah. And they're actually looking at, if you look at that next sentence, it says demonstrating fluency within 10. So really, 1st graders, they need to be fluent with adding and subtracting within 10, right? With the sum no greater than 10 or the difference no greater than 10. And then they have to be able to, using 10 frames, add and subtract within 20. So you're seeing that there's one objective. Good, Gisela. How about, give me another objective, somebody else.
This is Suzanne.
Go for it.
I put it in the chat, but do we need to assess whether everybody can even make it to the number 20 if they start at 1?
What do you think?
I should think so. I mean,
absolutely, right? I mean, how many of your kids coming into 1st grade won't even be able to count to 20? So what are you going to do with them? We're talking about differentiation now, right? So here's the 1st grade standard. This is what everybody, you know, the gods of education say every 1st grader has to know how to do this by the time they leave your class. But you're absolutely right. You have kiddos coming into your class who can't even count to 20, let alone have the number sense to add and subtract within 20. So this is where you're going to have to be that decision maker in your classroom, have that data, and differentiate your instruction, right? We can't teach to the whole group anymore. But let's stay right here on this standard, and let's deconstruct it. Let's find some more objectives within this standard.
ability to make 10.
Perfect. They have to be able to make 10. Good. Someone else.
Decomposing a number?
Oh, you got it.
Good. Decomposing numbers. Absolutely. So we got 3. Good. So we have add within 20, make 10. By making 10, we have subtracting within 20 by counting on. We could do fluency. Students will be able to demonstrate addition fluency within 10 by blah, 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 blah. Notice that each of my objectives has a by statement, right? That's super important with your, if you don't have a by statement, your students will be able to subtract within 20. Now you can't measure whether or not they can do it, right? Well, how do you know they're going to be able to subtract within 20? Oh, by counting on. So when you write an objective, you always want to make sure you have a by statement. And that's going to be how you measure that objective and how you know whether or not students have learned it. So the difference between an objective and a measurable objective, just what I said. Here's an objective. Students will be able to identify the attributes of the main character of a story. This is something you might see if you walk into a classroom, any classroom in California, posted up in front. Today students will be able to identify the attributes of a main character of a story. Great. How are they going to do that? Now, for me in my school as a principal, I've always asked my teachers to give me a by statement. Well, students will be able to identify the attributes of the main character of a story by using textual evidence to create a wordle. Now, this is a good opportunity to differentiate, right? Maybe some students don't want to do a wordle, so you can let them choose their outcome. But they're going to be able to identify the attributes of a main character doing one thing or another. Students will be able to identify the attributes. Didn't we already do that one? Oh, there's the by statement. That's a dumb slide. All right. So let's get into. Let me freeze. We're moving really quick. Deconstructing standards. How are we feeling? Does that make sense? That standards are complex, objectives are teachable. Good. So you don't want to. You're not going to create a lesson plan for a Common Core standard, right? You're gonna take the Common Core standard. Hold on a second. Let me pull up my lesson plan and show you what I'm talking about. Let's see here. That's one that's already been done.
Excuse me. So are you saying that our lesson plan should be based off our objective?
Absolutely.
Okay, got it.
So let's talk about that since we're here. Here's the form. Everybody could see this, right? So this is I love this form.
Yes.
Love this form. So your name at the top. Here's where you put your Common Core standard. You're going to put that big old long standard in there, but here's your measurable objective. What is a statement describing what students will be able to do by the end of the lesson, right? So that's that measurable objective piece. Then we're going to talk about why is this relevant? Teaching students why something is important for them is automatically going to increase their engagement, and it's going to help sink it into long-term memory. Boys and girls, we have to learn this because you're going to want to get some questions right on Jeopardy someday. I don't know. Whatever the relevance might be, all right? It might be, hey, you need to learn how to balance your checkbook. You might need to learn how to write a paper so you can get into college, whatever it might be. If it's not a relevant topic, good luck getting students engaged. What materials or resources are you going to need? This is just great to list out so you're ready and planned. And now we're going to get into this first section right here, activating or accessing students' prior knowledge. Purposely moving something connected to the new lesson from students' long-term memories into their working memories so they can continue to build upon that knowledge, right? So students have to think critically to answer that provoke deep thought and that produce original ideas. So how do you activate prior knowledge? One, you have to know what your students know. The purpose of activating prior knowledge is to transfer previous knowledge from what they've known to what is yet unlearned, right? It's easier to learn a new concept when you can connect it to something you know. What's an example where you've done that? What's an example where you learned something quickly because you already knew it? David, I'm sorry, I just caught your question. The state chooses the standards which are taught. So your grade level, whatever you're going to teach, has a list of standards that need to be taught. All right. So what do you
sorry. Just to be clear, like the principal chooses, so say in your previous example with the math, you said that the principal approaches the teacher and says, I want you to teach this particular standard.
That would
But
probably would never happen.
Yeah, wouldn't it be the case that they'd ask you to teach the entire grade band standard for like 6th grade ELA or something? So you have to teach.
For like one lesson, if they were doing like a formal observation on you.
Oh, I see. Okay, if that were
Yeah.
the situation, but
Yeah.
otherwise, you're expected to teach all of the standards for your grade. Is that correct?
You're expected to, but nobody in education believes that there's enough time or days in a
Right.
year
That was
to
my
do that.
concern.
Yeah, so you want to make sure you're identifying the most essential standards, and that research has already been done.
Gotcha. Thank you.
You're welcome. Right, Suzanne, perfect. So knitting, right? Here we go. So you knew how to do one stitch, so learning how to do a different kind of stitch was easier because you had made a connection, right? I knew how to throw a curveball, so when I got to college and learned how to throw a slider, it was very similar. I connected it to my prior knowledge. It's really, that's what you're thinking about. So you want to make sure when you're activating prior knowledge, when you're teaching new content, that you can connect it to. How can you help students connect to what they're learning? That's the first part of a lesson, right? Activating prior knowledge. I mean, after you've reviewed the objective, boys and girls, today we are learning how to do this, okay? All right. Let's keep moving. So teacher, during activating prior knowledge, prompts students to think about and access prior knowledge. They monitor some partner discussions. This is a great time because we want active engagement. We don't want learning to be voluntary in the classroom. So this is a great time to have students partnered up. You can call them, Phineas and Ferb, and I want Phineas to tell Ferb, I want Ferb to tell Phineas, and you can be very explicit about who you want talking. A's and B's. All right, A's, I want you to tell B's what experience do you have with this? And you're going to circulate and listen for a minute or two. You're going to clarify and confirm prior knowledge. You're going to connect prior knowledge to the measurable objective. Absolutely, great connection. Students are thinking about and accessing it, discussing their prior knowledge with a partner, and listening and responding to teacher clarifications and confirmations. So I keep hearing a sound. Is that somebody raising their hand or something? All right. All right, and ensure student engagement throughout, continuous checking for understanding, repeat any stage if needed, okay? So if you're finding that you need to do more activating of prior knowledge, do more activating of prior knowledge. I can't tell you how many observations I've sat in, especially with new teachers, where they think that they have to plow through a lesson from beginning to end. Your students, you can't say this is a 45-minute lesson. You have no idea how long a lesson's gonna be. It's totally student dependent. I've seen lessons that a teacher spent hours putting together, but their kids crushed it and it was a 15-minute lesson. I've also seen the flip where it took 2.5 days and they thought it was going to take 45 minutes. Your students are going to dictate, and the best teachers know how to take that form. Let me go back to it. And they know that each one of these sections, especially when we get to this right here where it says instruction, they can go back and forth between input model, structured practice, and guided practice, depending on the level of student understanding. You should not move on from input modeling unless at least 85% of your students are with you. You should not move on from structured practice unless 85% of your students are with you. You should not move on from guided practice unless 85% of your students are with you. How do you know if 85% of your students are with you? You have to check for understanding. How do you check for understanding with the whole class? Whiteboards, responders, random, calling popsicle sticks and you're confident you know it. Choral response, different ways of checking for understanding to make sure that you've got that level, that threshold that okay, I feel good moving on. So this form of instruction is kind of like flying a kite. You're letting the kite out a little at a time. Before you let the kite out, you're holding onto the kite, right? And the string. That's you as the teacher. That's the input model stage. You've got the kite and the string. You're saying, I'm showing you, I'm doing everything here. I'm going to think out loud. I'm going to do metacognition, right? This is where I'm going to pretend I'm the only person in the room. And I'm just going to think through the whole process and you're going to watch me. So the purpose of input model is to give students all the information they need successfully to complete the task and provide a clear model of how to do it perfectly. This is also where expert teachers will anticipate student misconceptions. They know what their students are going to mess up on, and they might even make that error and then self-correct so that they model how to self-correct that mistake. Great teachers do that. So if the initial instruction of every measurable objective always begins with input model, students' levels of concern will decrease and motivation will increase because before they're even given anything, they should not have anything in front of them except their desk at this stage of the lesson because they're watching you. You're going to help lower their anxiety because you're going to show them how to do it. You're going to show them how to do it perfectly. I can't tell you how many teachers will say, here's the objective. They hand out a paper and they say, go. Well, great for the kid who already knows what they're doing. But man, that poor kid who's lost, this is where you have to show them how, okay? This turns to a positive impact on transfer, motivation, retention, student-teacher relationships, everything. All right, so input. Teacher is ITEL, provides explicit input and knowledge in the rule. Students engage with a core response when prompted. Watch and listen. They model. This is where I do it. Give visual and verbal demonstrations. They might have a step chart, right? Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And they're modeling each one of those steps and they're saying it out loud. They are doing it perfectly. Students are watching and listening. Not a whole lot of interaction going on here. This is, again, modeling and input, okay? Well, maybe some choral response. This is the teaching part. This is where you are the teacher when we're talking about direct instruction. Again, you can repeat this stage if you feel like 85, because you'll be able to tell, even if you're not getting tremendous response from your kids, you could tell if they get it after this stage. You'll be looking at them and you'll see puzzled looks on their faces, or you'll see the kids like, no, let's go. All right, structured practice. This is, to me, one of the most important, well, they're super important, but this is called perfect practice, okay? This stage can be identified as so the first stage is I do it. This next stage, structured practice, is we do it together. Teacher walks students through the practice in a lockstep fashion. That means let's imagine that step chart. There's 4 steps to this math problem. We're going to do step 1 together. Ready? Here we go. Do step 1, show me. And I'm looking around. Great. Here's step 2. I'm going to do it. You do it. Ready, go. Now, this is where those kids are going to try to get ahead of you. No, stop. We're staying together for this. This is structured, very structured practice. You want to make sure that they can do this. All right. It is not the here's a question, see if you can figure it out. Ask me if you have a question stage. This is the beginning to move acquisition of the skill or concept. So it is perfect practice. Everybody say perfect practice. This is where you're not letting your students make any mistakes, but they're starting to do it, right? So now they might have whiteboards in front of them. Now they're starting to write something down, but you are still owning, you are still controlling what they're doing here, because you're not going to let them make a mistake, because once they start making mistakes, it's hard to unteach those mistakes. That's why when you're thinking, if you've got a class of 34 students, that's why this is so difficult. You have to be everywhere. That's why when we talk about that blended learning model and you have a group of 7 kids in front of you, why this is so much nicer. It's so much easier to make sure your students aren't making mistakes in that format. All right, so the structure practice, we do it together. Leads the pace. You're a teacher, you're leading the pacing. Nobody's going faster than you. If they are, you're crushing them. No, I'm just kidding. You could put a check, frowny face next to their name or something. Lead students through the parts of the rule, the process, the order, the step chart. Lead students through an example while asking questions. What's the rule? What's the next step? So very, very explicit, very direct. Demonstrates self-correction. That's a big part. Pre-corrects for potential errors and reviews the whole thing at the very end. Checks for understanding and connects knowledge to the measurable. You should always, that measurable objective that we talked about, right? Creating that objective, the teachable objective, the measurable objective. You're always connecting that. Remember, boys and girls, this is what we're here to learn today. That's our target. That's our goal. right? You know, good if you know how many of you are list people? You write things down on a list, and when you cross them off, you get to the end of the day, and you're like, yeah, today was a good day because you crossed a bunch of things off of the list, right? Think about your kids. Why? Think about what we learned in week 1. We are a pattern, our brains are pattern seeking devices. We start listing things in our brains automatically. You have to create an environment for your students where you're telling them, boys and girls, here's a list of things we are learning today. What are those called? Those are your objectives. And then at the end of the day, guess what you're going to do with those things? Did we learn that? Check. How good are your kids going to feel when they leave your classroom? When they checked off why they came to school. This is why we exist today at this school, is so you can learn these things, right? So that's what we're talking about here. All right, so the students here, they're following your pace. They're not working ahead. They're following through the parts of the rule, the order, participating in every example. They're demonstrating an understanding of the content, and they're connecting knowledge of the measurable objective. And then this is just redundant, right? Ensure student engagement, continuous check for understanding, repeat any stage if needed. What if you get to the end of structured practice and you're like, only half your kids seem to get it? What do you think you need to do? Do another example. Go back and do another input model. Show them how to do it again. Go back, right? Go back, right? So this is where you don't want to get too far ahead of yourself. You don't want to get to guided practice and then go to input model. You want to stay within these phases. And that's the sequence, right? The lesson sequence, activating prior knowledge, input model, structured practice, and now we're moving back to guided practice. Yeah, you should go back to the previous stage, the one right before it. Great question. All right, so let's talk about GP, guided practice. The purpose of this stage is to build accuracy with a little bit of less teacher support, right? You're letting that kite out. It's starting to fly. Provides ample opportunities for students to practice while avoiding errors and wrong learning as they move toward acquisition. So how does this compare to structured practice? Let's take a look. So during guided practice, so input model was I do it. Structured practice was we do it, I support you. Guided practice is we do it, you tell me how to do it. Or we do it, I support you. Hold on. I mixed it up in my head. Structured practice is kind of like we do it, you tell me how to do it. Guided practice, we do it, I'm going to kind of walk you through it, okay? So you're letting that string out a little bit at a time. So you're giving matching examples for students to work on. Again, you're doing step 1 together. Step 2. Now you might say, all right, do steps 1 and 2 with your partner, right? Not on your own yet. We're not independent yet. You've got your kids partnered up for a reason. Remember we talked about that collaborative learning environment? They might be working in groups. Have them work in groups. You're walking around and monitoring students, but you don't want them to mess up. And you know, and if you're getting too many errors during guided practice, you probably need to do structured practice over again. Anytime I've seen, when I do a lesson observation with my teachers, if I see a lot of errors happening in guided practice, that means structured practice fell apart, because that means they weren't lockstep with everyone. Think about it. If you nailed structured practice and you knew that all of your students were ready for that next stage, you could let them work in a group and they're going to do really well on this. There might be some mistakes, but you're going to be right there to help, or their peers are going to be right there to help solve them. Use praise, prompt, leave strategy, which is, hey, you're doing an excellent job. Have you thought about this? And then you leave. That's all you're doing. You don't want to do the thinking for them. Too often we see teachers doing the thinking for kids. You just want to give them a prompt and then take off. Reinforce accuracy over speed. It's not about being the first person done. It's about being done right. Check for understanding, connect. Students, they're doing it, right? You're monitoring and supporting, they're working in groups or pairs. Complete examples in pairs or by themselves with teacher monitoring. The building accuracy, demonstrating understanding, connecting knowledge to the measurable objective. Ensure student engagement through continuous checking. Now, this is where you might have a lesson plan. Let's go back to that wonderful lesson plan. And under guided practice, you have what you're doing, right? Here's teacher example. Students are going to do example A, example B. You might, because you remember, you're the decision maker in the classroom, you might say, wow, I really think they need another example here. So do it, right? Don't let your lesson plan, just because you only put 2 examples in there, don't let that handcuff you into making decisions on the fly. Your students are going to dictate the pacing. Or the opposite might be true. During structured practice, you might have had 3 or 4 examples on your lesson plan, but you noticed after the first one that 100% of your kids get it. What do you think you should do? Should you do the other 3 examples? Only if you want your kids bored out of their mind, right? Move on to guided practice. Let your kids dictate the pacing of your lesson. As long as you're really making sure you're taking good data, right, and making sure that you know exactly where your students are. Okay? All right, so we've hit structured practice, guided practice. Now we get into closure. Wait, we're not even into independent practice yet. This is where you close it up. Have students work problems or answer questions to provide evidence that they've learned it, right? So at least to me, it was always 85%, but 80% of the students demonstrate mastery. What does closure look like? This could be a ticket out the door. This would be your independent practice too, right here, and your assessment. This could be all 3 of these sections kind of go together. But your closures, you want to revisit that objective. You want to go back to, remember, boys and girls. Today, our goal was to learn X. How many of you feel like you've learned how to do X? Show me, thumbs up. Excellent. How many of you still need a little more support? All right, why don't you come back and see me in the next 5 minutes and I'll give you that little more support. But you already know this data because you've been walking around your classroom and you see it, okay? And then that independent practice, maybe it's homework. I'm not a big fan of homework as independent practice because the one thing about independent practice, there's a key word in the term independent practice, and it's practice. And I don't know how many of you are athletes, but the last time when I played baseball, college and high school, every practice I went to, there were coaches there helping me. And so if something is still practice, then the teacher should still be there supporting the student. And if you're assigning independent practice as homework, there's no coach. You're not helping them. They could be at home doing it wrong over and over again. Great. Now look what you get to clean up the next day. You have to unteach some wrong learning, and that is so much harder than teaching something new. All right, so I can get into a pedagogical argument with anybody here on the practice of homework. I'm not a big fan of it because we can't control the environment. It doesn't teach responsibility. I don't care what you say. Students will be responsible students do homework. Irresponsible students don't. I'm not a big fan of the practice altogether. But I don't tell my teachers that they can't do homework. They get to make the decisions in that one, but they know where I stand on it. Independent practice is a ticket out the door, right? Before you leave my classroom, you should be able to answer this one question. And this is where you take maybe DOK, right? DOK, the 4 levels of depth of knowledge with Webb's, and maybe you have 4 different questions that you ask, and you could tell the students if you want to try for a level 4, which is way harder, then you can incentivize it or something. And then you have your assessment, how you're integrating technology. And then even on this form, I've got examples of strategies for engaging students. So I encourage you to download this, print this, memorize this, because when you walk into a teacher interview and you're able to respond when they ask you about lesson sequencing and you can walk them through something like this, you will get hired. All right. And not to mention, if you walk into a classroom, when you get your keys to your classroom and you teach like this, you will be a rock star. And that's what's most important. All right. From current slide. Man, talk about a fast hour, huh? It's already 7:50. I love this. Week 3 is my favorite week of this course. All right, here we go. So guided practice, again, you want to assure that student engagement, checking for understanding, making sure you're going back if you need to, go back to the previous section of that lesson before you move on. Independent is about building speed, confidence, and automaticity, allowing students time to explain what they learned. There we go. I monitor, so you're still monitoring kids, give a lot of feedback to students. Really encourage them here. We think about that growth mindset piece. Remember when Carol Dweck was talking about how to give that growth mindset kind of encouragement, not great job, but wow, I love your work ethic and you're working so hard and Boy, you're so accurate at that, or something like that. Demonstrate increased speed, mastery of the objective, and you can still go back. So the components of a direct instruction lesson plan. You have your standard, your measurable objective with a buy statement. Remember, a measurable objective has to have a buy statement or else it's just an objective. Lesson relevance or importance, resources, materials. How are you going to access prior knowledge? You might have to teach prior knowledge. That's one thing here. You're not always activating prior knowledge. You might have to do an activity that connects them to what you're about to teach them, right? Taking their culture into consideration. I do, we do, you help. We do, I help. Closure, you do, I help. Right? I do, we do, you do. Got that? Excellent. And then you assess. And your assessment should be solid. If they're not, what are you going to do? You have to reevaluate the way you taught it, right? It's never the kid's fault. It's never the kid's fault. We always want to take the blame as the owners of the instruction. What can you do differently to make sure your kids get it? Always use the standards. Always use current data. Always think about your pacing. Pacing is huge. Always think about whether or not what you're teaching is relevant and how you can make it relevant. And always plan questions. Oh man, this is a big one. Let's spend a little time on this one. Plan your questions before you ask them. I can't tell you how many times I'll walk into a teacher's classroom and they're teaching and they ask questions kind of off the cuff, right? Let me find my Webb's depth of knowledge. So they ask questions off the cuff because they didn't plan what questions they were going to ask. This is so big. So we have Webb's depth of knowledge here. We have 4 levels of knowledge. Level 1 is the recall section, right here. Level 2, skills and concepts. 3, strategic thinking. 4, extended thinking. The problem with when you're asking questions that are just off the cuff, let's say you're reading a story with your students and you're going to just pause and ask a question because it popped in your head. Chances are, and this isn't a slight on anyone, chances are if you're going to ask a question off the cuff, it's going to be a low-level question. It's going to be a level 1 question. You're going to ask them to recall or repeat something or state who, what, when, where, why. But if you're thoughtful about the questions that you want your students to answer, now you can write down questions, put them on Post-its, and put them in your book so that when you get to a certain spot, you can ask a student a higher level question, which increases the engagement, which increases the rigor in your lesson. You want to plan the questions you're going to ask your students. If you just rely on kind of bird walking, they're always going to be low level. They just will. I've seen some of the smartest people I know who, when they plan, they plan amazingly, but when they're just kind of doing it off the cuff, it's just natural. That's where we go to. Sometimes you might get somebody ask like a cause and effect question or compare or do a prediction or something, which is fine. But you want to start asking questions and watch. Here's a great document that let me move this so I can. There's a great document that I share right here, Webb's Depth of Knowledge Guide. This is from 2009. It's old, but it's still good. And it really talks about all the Webb's Depth of Knowledge possible products, the roles of the teacher and the students, activities for each level, right? So level 2, having students create sculptures or demonstrations or presentations. Here are things that they can do, some activities, and for level 2 activities, level 3 activities, Venn diagrams, writing a letter, preparing or conducting a debate. So you're seeing this higher level of understanding. What you need to know about something increases dramatically when you go higher up Webb's depth of knowledge. Same with Bloom's taxonomy as well. So plan your questions. All right, let's get back to. All right, so that's a link right there to that guide that I just shared with you. So, and you've got that lesson plan example. Again, like I said, print that out, add it to your something great to hold on to for a long time. All right, so today we talked about teachable objectives and deconstructing a California Common Core standard. Hopefully you found that informative. Identifying the components of a direct instruction lesson plan. What is your responsibility? What are the kids' responsibilities during each of those components? And we briefly touched upon Webb's DOK, depth of knowledge. So let's do a Kahoot. Y'all ready? Next week, got journals, discussions, and your direct instruction lesson plan. Please use that format. And here we go. Let's get out of there. Oops, yes. I made some adjustments to it before tonight. Sorry. And let's Kahoot. You ready? Your PIN for Kahoot, 277673. And here we go. 9 questions tonight. When preparing a lesson, you should always consider what? Every single one of them, your levels of questions, your relevance or importance of your lesson, and pacing. Good. Suzanne in the lead. Here we go. How many levels are there in Webb's depth of knowledge? There are 4 levels. 4 levels. Before creating a lesson, the teacher needs to pull what out of a standard? Absolutely. Man, rocking and rolling. Here we go. Activate prior knowledge at good. At the beginning of the lesson, make that connection. What stage in direct instruction lesson plan is known as perfect practice? Ooh, structured practice is perfect practice, lockstep practice. That's the time where you're not letting your students make any mistakes whatsoever. You are lockstepping with them. Structured practice is we do it together as guided practice. Excellent. Good. And how often should you check for understanding during a lesson? Constantly. It's a close one. At the end of the lesson, you still need to what? Provide closure, independent practice, and assess. And finally, after the lesson, it's important to adjust and reteach, and then have a glass of wine. All right, let's see who our winner is tonight. Tracy. Man, that was a close one. Kirsten almost snuck it out. Congratulations. All right. So we are done for tonight. And if anybody has any questions, please stick around. Otherwise, have a great evening. And like I said, I'll be out of town all weekend, so I won't get the grading for week 3 for probably the middle of next week. So I apologize for that. But yeah, anyway, have an outstanding weekend, everybody. And thanks for a great evening.
I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, so I want to teach high school